What's a fascinating rabbit hole or subculture you stumbled into that most people don't know exists? Story 1 Locksport is what competitive and hobbyist lockpicking calls itself, and it is a genuinely enormous subculture with international competitions, dedicated YouTube channels with millions of subscribers, tiered ranking systems borrowed from martial arts, and an ethics code whose primary rule is that you never pick a lock you don't own, or that you haven't received explicit permission to pick. The entry point for most people is Lockpicking Lawyer, a YouTube channel run by a Washington, D.C. attorney whose face has never appeared on camera and whose name has never been officially disclosed, who has posted hundreds of videos methodically opening locks, including many that are marketed as high security, while calmly narrating the specific technique involved. The channel has accumulated millions of subscribers who are not particularly interested in breaking into things and who are not criminals. They are people who find the combination of technical precision and satisfying physical outcome deeply watchable, in the same way that videos of machinery doing exactly what machinery is supposed to do are satisfying. The rabbit hole deepens into the competitive dimension, where Locksport competitors submit video proof of picking specific locks to receive ranking credentials from organizations like The Tool and Locksport International. Rankings are earned, debated, and taken seriously within the community. Some locks are considered essentially impossible to pick within reasonable time by any currently known technique. Discovering a new method to open one of these produces the equivalent of a scientific breakthrough within Locksport circles. The community's consistent position on security is counterintuitively useful. Their detailed public documentation of exactly which locks can be opened and how has pushed manufacturers to produce genuinely better locks, and has helped consumers make more informed choices about what they're actually buying when they buy a padlock. Story 2 Urban Exploration, Urbex, is the practice of accessing and photographing abandoned, restricted, or otherwise inaccessible man-made structures. Closed hospitals, shuttered asylums, decommissioned factories, sealed subway stations, drainage systems, rooftops, and any other space where the combination of decay and restricted access has created an environment that the public doesn't see. The community is global, extensively documented online, and occupies a legal gray area that varies significantly between jurisdictions and between specific locations. The photography that comes out of urbex communities is sometimes genuinely extraordinary. The specific aesthetic of a place that has been frozen at the moment of its abandonment and then allowed to decay according to its own logic is difficult to replicate artificially, and the photographers who do it well produce images that have been shown in galleries and published in books. Nature reclaiming an indoor space, trees growing through hospital corridors, pools flooding with moss, machinery entombed in decades of rust and vines, produces visual effects that architecture photography in active buildings can't capture. The rabbit hole begins when you find an urbex forum or subreddit and start reading the trip reports, detailed first-person accounts of accessing specific locations, the techniques used to get inside, what was found, and crucially, what was left. The urbex ethic is take nothing but photographs, leave nothing but footprints, which is taken seriously enough that the community has developed specific contempt for vandals who tag or destroy the spaces they access. The deeper you go, the more you find. A community of people who have documented the interiors of places that no longer officially exist, producing archives of spaces that will never be photographed again because they've since been demolished or sealed, and occasionally uncovering things in abandoned spaces that turn out to be genuinely significant. Documents, artwork, historical artifacts that no one official knew were there. Story 3 Competitive Scrabble is not the game you played at Christmas. The specific gap between the casual version most people know and the competitive version that exists at the highest levels of the game is so large that they are almost meaningfully different activities, separated by the same distance that separates a weekend tennis player from Wimbledon. The entry point for the rabbit hole is usually learning that competitive Scrabble players memorize every valid two-letter word in the official Scrabble Players Dictionary. There are over 100 of them, many of them words that most native English speakers have never encountered in their lives, including words like chi, za, si, jo, and the various other short valid words that exist in the competitive lexicon specifically because the game has generated demand for them. This is not cheating or exploitation. It is the game played at the level where winning requires knowing the full toolset. From there, the rabbit hole expands. There are valid 7-letter words that no one would ever use in ordinary English that serious players learn specifically because 7-letter plays use all tiles and trigger a bonus. There is a specific preparation strategy for learning bingos, the competitive term for plays that use all 7 tiles. That involves studying word lists, sorted by the probability of having specific letter combinations in your rack. There is tile tracking, the practice of mentally accounting for which tiles have been played and adjusting your strategy based on what remains. The documentary Word Wars follows competitive Scrabble players at the 2002 National Scrabble Championship, and is the standard entry point for people who want to understand the subculture's specific texture, the obsession, the vocabulary, the circuit of tournaments, and the players whose lives are organized around a game most people associate with family evenings. Story 4 sovereign citizens believe they have discovered, through research into obscure legal history and constitutional theory, that the United States government secretly converted American citizens into a form of maritime commerce entity without their knowledge, and that by performing specific administrative actions, filing particular documents, using specific phrasing and interactions with authorities, placing certain symbols on vehicles and identification, a person can unilaterally reassert their status as a sovereign natural person to whom most laws, taxes, court orders, and government authority do not apply. This is not a fringe belief held by a handful of people. The FBI has designated sovereign citizen extremism as a domestic terrorism threat. Tens of thousands of Americans self-identify with some version of sovereign citizen ideology, and the ideology has exported to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom in adapted forms. The specific legal theories involved have no basis in any mainstream legal interpretation and have been rejected by every court that has considered them, including when argued by lawyers sympathetic to the underlying framework. The rabbit hole is the specific content of the theories. They are elaborate, internally consistent, and built from selective readings of real legal documents, constitutional provisions, and historical events combined with invented concepts presented in the Register of Legal Scholarship. The yellow fringe on the American flag means you're in a military court. The all-capitals version of your name is a corporate entity the government created without your knowledge. The comma in your birth certificate changes its legal meaning. None of these claims are true. All of them are specific and detailed and cross-reference each other in ways that produce the texture of a genuine legal discovery. The YouTube videos of sovereign citizens arguing with police officers during traffic stops are where most people encounter this world. They're simultaneously funny and deeply uncomfortable. Story 5, The Death Zone, is the name given to altitudes above 8,000 meters above sea level, where the partial pressure of oxygen is insufficient to sustain human life indefinitely. At this altitude, your body is consuming itself faster than it can recover, and the longer you remain, the faster your physical and cognitive function degrades until you die. There are 14 mountains in the world with summits above 8,000 meters, and the communities of mountaineers, researchers, historians, and obsessives who document everything that happens on these mountains form a specific and deeply engaged subculture. The entry point for most people is reading about Everest, which has been climbed by thousands of people and has become sufficiently commercialized that wealthy clients with limited technical skill pay for guided expeditions at costs of $50,000 to $100,000. The bodies of climbers who died on Everest and could not be recovered remain on the mountain because the cost and risk of retrieval exceeds what is logistically feasible. and they are visible to other climbers in some sections of the standard routes. Specific, named individuals who have become trail markers, which is its own dimension of strangeness to sit with. The rabbit hole deepens when you move from Everest to the other 13 8,000ers, which are far less commercially accessible and have death rates that put Everest's in perspective. K2 kills approximately 1 climber for every 4 who summit. Annapurna has historically killed more than 1 in 3 who summit. The specific conditions at each mountain, the specific accidents and decisions that produced specific deaths, and the specific debates within the mountaineering community about acceptable risk, commercial guiding, and the ethics of leaving people on mountains are a body of content so large that people spend years inside it. Story 6: Major League Eating is the governing body of professional competitive eating in the United States, and it is a real organization with sanctioned competitions, world records, rankings, prize money, and athletes who prepare for events with the same systematic approach that professional athletes in other sports apply to their training. The most famous events are televised, including Nathan's famous hot dog eating contest on Coney Island, which has been held on the 4th of July every year since 1916 and is now broadcast on ESPN. The rabbit hole begins when you look at the training regimens. Professional competitive eaters don't simply have large stomachs. They train their stomachs to expand. The process involves eating large quantities of water and low-calorie foods to gradually increase the stomach's comfortable volume, combined with jaw conditioning exercises to build the speed and endurance of chewing. The specific physics of competitive eating. The water dunking technique that allows hot dog buns to be consumed faster. The tilting of the neck that assists swallowing at speed. The specific pacing strategies are documented and debated within the competitive eating community as seriously as technique is analyzed in any other sport. The careers of the top competitors are genuinely remarkable by any comparative standard. Joey Chestnut, the dominant American competitive eater for nearly 2 decades, held world records in multiple food categories simultaneously and competed at an elite level for far longer than most athletes maintain peak performance. The Japanese competitive eating tradition produced Takeru Kobayashi, whose domination of the Nathan's contest in the early 2000s effectively broke the existing understanding of what human stomach capacity could accommodate in 12 minutes. Whether it's a sport is a question the community debates with the same seriousness that similar questions are debated about chess, darts, and poker. Story 7: Crossword construction is a profession, an art form, and a competition, and the community of people who construct crosswords for major publications, primarily the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Wall Street Journal, operates with the kind of mutual awareness, collegial rivalry, and hierarchical credentialing that characterizes any small professional subculture that takes itself seriously. The documentary Wordplay, released in 2006, introduced a general audience to this world through the lens of the American Crossword Puzzle Tournament, which has been held annually since 1978 and is the premier competitive venue for solvers. But the rabbit hole of construction is its own separate dimension, the rules and conventions that govern an acceptable crossword grid. Symmetry. Minimum black square percentage. No repeated words, no unchecked letters, no obscure proper nouns without crosses that allow them to be derived from the crossing words are extensive, and mastering them takes years of practice and editorial feedback. The status hierarchy within night crossword construction is explicit. A Sunday puzzle is the top of the prestige ladder, followed by themed weekday puzzles, with the Friday and Saturday themeless puzzles being considered the most technically demanding construction challenges. Constructors who have published in the NIT know their total publication count and the precise distribution of their publications by day of the week. The solver community mirrors this with its own expertise and status markers. The specific ability to solve a Friday or Saturday night crossword in under 10 minutes is a benchmark that serious solvers track, compare, and post about in dedicated forums where solve times and techniques are analyzed with the same granularity that competitive athletes analyze performance data. Story 8: Dumpster diving as a philosophy. The freegan subculture that lives on what consumer society throws away. Freeganism is an anti-consumerist philosophy and lifestyle practice built around the observation that consumer societies discard enormous quantities of usable, edible, and functional goods, and that a person can meet many of their material needs by accessing this waste stream rather than participating in the commercial economy that produces it. The name combines free and vegan, the latter reflecting the movement's historical roots in radical environmental and animal rights activism, though contemporary freeganism has expanded considerably beyond that specific origin. The entry point is usually learning that grocery stores, restaurants, and food manufacturers regularly discard large quantities of food that is within its edible window but past its sell-by date, or cosmetically imperfect, or at the end of a production batch. People who regularly dumpster dive behind supermarkets report finding bread, produce, meat, dairy, and prepared foods that are entirely safe to eat and that represent, at an aggregate level, a significant fraction of the food those stores purchase. The scale of food waste in consumer economies is documented extensively in the environmental and food systems literature and is genuinely staggering. The deeper rabbit hole is the community of people who have built entire lives around minimizing their participation in the cash economy. People who furnish their homes from what other people discard on moving day, who eat almost entirely from what they find in waste streams, who travel by volunteering for free housing in exchange for labor, and who have developed the specific skills, knowing which stores discard on which nights, what's worth keeping, what's genuinely unusable, that make this lifestyle navigable. Whether it's a political statement, a practical strategy, an environmental necessity, or some combination of all three depends on which freegan you're talking to. Story 9: The Flat Earth Community, a belief system that has generated its own science, its own experiments, and its own celebrities. Flat Earth belief, in its contemporary form, is not simply the passive acceptance of a pre-scientific cosmology. It is an active, organized, internally consistent system of claims about the physical world that has generated dedicated YouTube channels with hundreds of thousands of subscribers, annual conferences, international travel communities, and a specific methodology for conducting experiments that flat Earth proponents argue demonstrate the Earth's flatness against the deceptions of mainstream science. The rabbit hole is entering the internal logic rather than simply observing the external claims. Flat Earth believers have explanations for every piece of evidence that mainstream science offers for a spherical Earth. The appearance of ships disappearing hull first over the horizon is atmospheric refraction. The circular shadow the Earth casts on the Moon during lunar eclipses is produced by the disk from the right angle. The ability to circumnavigate the globe is explained by the specific map projection flat earthers use, which places the Arctic at the center, the known continents spread across the disk, and Antarctica as the ice wall at the outer rim. These explanations are internally consistent enough that engaged debate with a committed flat earther quickly reaches a level of specific technical argument about optics, geometry, and atmospheric physics that most people aren't equipped to engage with definitively, because the specific claims, Bedford level, experiment interpretations, atmospheric refraction calculations, the specific behavior of laser levels over water require enough background knowledge that casual dismissal is easier than technical engagement. The community's relationship to mainstream scientific institutions is the most interesting dimension. It is explicitly and completely adversarial, treating every piece of evidence and every authority as part of a global deception, which makes it unfalsifiable in principle and specifically designed to absorb contrary evidence as confirmation. Story 10: The World of Professional Foraging. People who navigate public land by what's edible and when foraging for wild food is a practice that ranges from casual mushroom hunting on weekend hikes to the professional level knowledge maintained by a small community of people who have systematically mapped what grows where, in what seasons, in the specific ecosystems they work within, and who use this knowledge as a meaningful portion of their actual food supply rather than as an occasional supplement. The rabbit hole opens when you start reading about the level of botanical and mycological knowledge required to forage safely and productively. Mushroom identification specifically is a domain where confident misidentification has killed people. Several species of Amanita, the most dangerous mushroom genus, closely resemble edible species in ways that have led to deaths even among experienced foragers. And the specifics of how to distinguish edible from deadly in any given mushroom encounter require a level of detailed comparative observation that most people find much more demanding than they expected. The deeper community is people who forage at the level where they know not just what's edible, but the microecology, which specific woodland edges in their region produce ramps in April, where the moral flush typically appears relative to specific tree species and soil types, which beaches expose specific edible seaweeds at what tide conditions. How to find and distinguish the several species of wild garlic from their inedible lookalikes. This knowledge is largely oral, accumulated through years of practice, and not easily replaced by any field guide. There's also a specific tension in the foraging community between people who share location information openly, believing that sustainable foraging depends on broad education about what's harvestable and what isn't, and people who treat their specific spots as confidential resources to be protected from overharvesting. Story 11, Competitive Magic, The Gathering, a game that has produced a permanent professional circuit since 1996 Magic. The Gathering, the trading card game, published by Wizards of the Coast since 1993, has sustained a professional competitive scene continuously since 1996, longer than the professional scenes of most video game esports. At the highest level, Magic is a game played by people who have invested years into understanding a rule system of extraordinary depth, a card pool of tens of thousands of individually different cards, and a metagame, the evolving ecosystem of which decks and strategies are currently dominant and why, that changes continuously as new cards are released approximately 4 times per year. The rabbit hole begins when you understand the economic dimension. Competitive Magic operates on a secondary market for cards that functions like a commodity market, with specific cards worth hundreds or thousands of dollars based on their power level and tournament legality, and with the specific knowledge of which cards are about to become valuable, because they synergize with an upcoming release, or because a tournament result has demonstrated their power, being genuine financial intelligence that serious players track carefully. The specific culture of competitive Magic is its own world, the Pro Tour, the World Championship, the specific archetypes that have defined eras of the game, the players who have sustained professional careers for a decade or more, the specific deck names and their cultural connotations within the community. A combo deck versus a control deck versus an aggro deck is not just strategic classification, but aesthetic identity within the competitive community. The game's rules complexity is also genuinely significant. The complete rulebook is over 250 pages, and judges who rule on disputes at competitive events undergo formal training and examination. Tournament-level misinterpretation of the rules is an area of knowledge in its own right. Story 12, Ghost Hunting as a Hobby, Night Vision Cameras, EMF detectors, and a worldwide amateur community. Ghost hunting is a hobby practiced by a large and organized community of people who visit reportedly haunted locations, old buildings, cemeteries, former prisons, hospitals, equipped with a range of electronic devices and attempt to document evidence of paranormal activity. The community has its own equipment, its own methodology, its own vocabulary, its own media ecosystem of podcasts and YouTube channels, and its own internal debates about what constitutes genuine evidence versus misidentification or hoax. The entry point for most people is shows like Ghost Hunters, Ghost Adventures, or Most Haunted, which have run for multiple seasons and created the basic aesthetic grammar that the amateur community subsequently adopted. But the rabbit hole is the amateur community rather than the television shows. People who conduct their own investigations, build their own equipment, maintain their own databases of reportedly haunted locations, and produce their own content documenting what they find. The equipment used in amateur ghost hunting is simultaneously genuinely interesting from an electronics perspective and scientifically controversial in terms of what it actually measures. EMP detectors respond to electrical fields from wiring and devices. Spirit boxes scan rapidly through radio frequencies and produce audio fragments that investigators interpret as communication. Thermal imaging cameras reveal temperature differentials. Audio recorders are reviewed for EP. Sounds in the recording that weren't heard in real time, that investigators interpret as paranormal voices. The internal debate within the ghost hunting community about methodology and evidence standards is more sophisticated than outsiders typically expect. There are people in the community who take a rigorously skeptical approach to individual pieces of claimed evidence while still finding the practice meaningful for reasons that don't depend on any specific paranormal claim being confirmed. Story 13, the world of competitive puzzle construction, jigsaw puzzles with hidden messages, impossible surfaces, and no-pictures jigsaw puzzles occupy an enormous casual market. But the rabbit hole is the specific community of puzzle designers, collectors, and competitive solvers who occupy the extreme end of the hobby. This includes puzzles that are entirely one color with no image variation, puzzles whose edges are identical and whose orientation can't be determined except by the interlocking of specific pieces, puzzles that deliberately include extra pieces or missing pieces as a design feature, puzzles that, when complete, reveal their image is actually a different image than the one shown on the box, and puzzles that disassemble into a different picture than they assemble into. The competitive dimension exists at the World Jigsaw Puzzle Championship and its national qualifying events, where teams of 4 people compete to assemble a 500-piece puzzle as quickly as possible. The speed at which the top teams work, pieces separated by color gradation, borders built simultaneously by different team members, image sections assigned based on individual members' visual pattern recognition strengths, is genuinely startling to watch if your reference point is assembling a puzzle alone over several evenings. The collector community is its own rabbit hole. Vintage wooden jigsaw puzzles from the 1930s, when puzzles were a major adult leisure activity and were made from mahogany and walnut with hand-cut interlocking pieces in non-standard shapes, are collectibles that sell for significant sums in specialist markets. The specific manufacturers, the specific artists whose work was reproduced, the specific cutting styles associated with specific makers. All of this is documented and valued by a small but deeply engaged collector community. The most extreme puzzle design community produces puzzles that are deliberately adversarial, puzzles with gradient images that make color sorting unhelpful, puzzles whose image is a photorealistic reproduction of another puzzle's image, puzzles printed on both sides with different images. Story 14, extreme couponing. A subculture that turned grocery shopping into a structured financial operation. Extreme couponing is the practice of combining manufacturer coupons, store coupons, loyalty program discounts, and sales cycles to reduce grocery bills to a small fraction of the sticker price, and in some cases to receive items for negative net cost. Paying less than nothing by stacking discounts on items the store pays the shopper, in effect, to take. The practice became a widely known phenomenon through the TLC reality show Extreme Couponing, which aired from 2011. But the community predates the show and operates at a sophistication level the show mostly doesn't represent. The rabbit hole is the system. Serious extreme couponers maintain databases of which coupons are currently valid, which stores have which policies about stacking manufacturer and store coupons, which items are currently on sale at which stores, and how these factors combine to produce the maximum discount on specific purchases at specific times. The timing is significant. Most grocery stores run sales cycles on a schedule, and knowing when an item you have a coupon for will also be on sale and will also trigger a store loyalty offer is the specific knowledge that separates casual couponing from the results the extreme couponers produce. The stockpile is one of the distinctive features, extreme couponers who get items for near zero cost, buy many of them and store them, building inventories of specific products that can last for months or years. The stockpile rooms documented by the TLC show, floor-to-ceiling shelving units of identical canned goods, cereals, and toiletries, are simultaneously an impressive display of strategic consumer behavior and a monument to a specific kind of obsessive systematization. The community is genuinely helpful to each other in ways that aren't typically visible from outside. Coupon databases and deal alerts are shared through specific forums, Facebook groups, and dedicated apps, with the collective intelligence of the community doing work no individual could do alone. Story 15: The Speedrunning Community. People who have spent thousands of hours finding shortcuts in video game speedrunning is the practice of completing a video game as fast as possible, typically measured precisely to the millisecond and verified through recorded video. The community is global, organized through speedrun.com as the primary leaderboard repository, and contains several thousand games each, with their own categories, their own active communities, their own discovered techniques, and their own records that may stand for years or be broken in a single week by a single discovery. The entry point for most people is watching the Games Done Quick charity marathons, where speedrunners demonstrate their fastest completions of games live on Twitch, with the audience watching in real time. The specific pleasures of watching a speedrun are different from playing a game. You're watching someone exploit the gap between what a game is supposed to do and what it actually does when pushed against its own physics and logic engine, and the exploits can be genuinely extraordinary. A runner using a specific sequence of inputs to bypass a wall, walking out of the intended game space and arriving at the credit screen in a fraction of the intended playtime. The deeper rabbit hole is the technical dimension of speedrunning research. Finding a new trick in a game, a way to store a specific value in memory that allows a normally impossible action to occur, a collision detection failure that allows a player to pass through solid geometry, a sequence of inputs that causes the game's state to desynchronize in a useful way, requires understanding the specific implementation of the game's code in a way that is somewhere between speed game playing and reverse engineering. The community has also produced entire subgenres: blindfolded speedruns, randomized game speedruns where the item locations are shuffled, and races where multiple runners compete simultaneously. Story 16: The World of Competitive Barbecue. A circuit of events with five-figure prize money and a deeply tribal culture. Competition barbecue in the United States is a subculture with national organizations, sanctioned competitions, world championships, prize money that occasionally reaches into five figures, and a culture of teams, rigs, sponsorships, and rivalries that mirrors the structure of professional sport while remaining largely invisible to people outside the South and Midwest where it's concentrated. The Kansas City Barbecue Society is the largest sanctioning body, certifying judges, sanctioning events, and setting the rules for what counts as an acceptable entry in the four standard KCB's competition categories: chicken, pork ribs, pork shoulder, and beef brisket. KCB's certified judges are trained to evaluate entries on appearance, taste, and texture using a specific rubric, and the judging is blind. The team that produced an entry is not known to the judges who score it. The rabbit hole is the preparation that teams put into competition entries. The specific cuts of meat, the suppliers who produce the most competitive product for that cut, the injection recipes, liquid marinades pushed directly into the meat through syringes before cooking, the rub formulations, the specific wood combinations used for smoke, the cooking temperatures and times, the specific cooling and resting periods, and the presentation in the judging box are all areas of active development and closely guarded craft knowledge. The top competition teams travel to multiple events per year, invest significantly in custom-built trailer rigs housing their cooking equipment, and treat their formulas and techniques as proprietary. The community around the events, the camaraderie, the camping, the collective cooking throughout the night, the specific culture of teams that have been competing against each other for years, produces a social environment that is its own reason to participate independent of competitive outcome. Story 17: Amateur Radio, a licensed community that still does things the internet can't. Amateur radio, ham radio, is a hobby involving the use of radio frequency communications for non-commercial purposes, practiced by licensed operators around the world who can legally transmit on specific frequency bands. The license requirement, which involves passing a technical exam, creates a barrier to entry that has kept the community both self-selecting for technical interest and smaller than it would otherwise be. There are approximately 750,000 licensed amateur radio operators in the United States alone. Most people's mental image of amateur radio is that it has been made obsolete by the internet. If you can video call anyone in the world from your phone for free, why would you operate radio equipment to talk to someone in another country? The rabbit hole is all the things amateur radio does that the internet doesn't. Emergency communications is the most significant. When natural disasters destroy internet and cellular infrastructure, amateur radio operators provide emergency communication capability that doesn't depend on any commercial infrastructure. The networks of ham radio operators who activate during hurricanes, earthquakes, and wildfires are the only non-satellite communication available in some affected areas, and they are genuinely consequential in disaster response. But the rabbit hole deepens into the specific technical interests that the hobby sustains. Moon bounce communication, where radio signals are aimed at the moon and the faint reflection received on Earth, completing a round trip of nearly 500,000 miles. Weak signal digital modes that allow two-way communication using power levels of a fraction of a watt. Direction-finding competitions where participants navigate to hidden transmitters using radio equipment. Building and testing radio equipment from scratch as an exercise in electronics engineering. These are genuinely niche technical pursuits that maintain their own communities, competitions, and published literature. Story 18: The world of competitive origami. Paper folding as a mathematical and artistic discipline with academic dimensions. Origami at the competitive and advanced hobbyist level is not the paper cranes and fortune tellers of elementary school. It is a mathematical discipline, an art form, and a technical challenge whose most advanced practitioners produce works that have informed engineering, medical device design, and aerospace research, while also being extraordinarily beautiful objects created from a single sheet of paper without cuts or glue. The rabbit hole opens with understanding that origami has been formalized mathematically. Origami crease patterns, the maps of folds required to produce a specific design, can be described and generated mathematically, and the field of computational origami produces algorithms that can generate the crease pattern for any three-dimensional shape from a flat sheet of paper. Robert Lang's TreeMaker software, developed by a physicist and origami artist, generates crease patterns for arbitrary stick figure representations of animals, and is used by some of the world's most accomplished origami artists to design complex models. The designs produced at the cutting edge of complex origami: insects with individually articulated legs, an antenna, and textured wing surfaces; crustaceans with full anatomical detail; dragons with individually scaled surfaces, are technically equivalent to engineering challenges, and the hours required to fold them from a single sheet of uncut paper are measured in the hundreds. The aerospace and medical connection is real. Origami folding patterns have been used to design deployable solar panels for satellites, stent devices for cardiac surgery, and structural elements that need to pack flat and expand into three-dimensional shapes in confined deployment environments. The mathematics of how flat materials fold into three-dimensional structures without tearing is genuinely useful to engineering, which has given origami an unlikely academic and industrial research dimension alongside its art form status. Story 19: The Backrooms, an internet mythology that grew into a genuinely unsettling shared universe. The Backrooms began as a single image, a photograph of an empty office space, yellow-tinged fluorescent lighting, carpet tiles in a specific pattern of beige, and the total absence of any person, door, window, or exit visible in the frame. Someone captioned it with the suggestion that this was what you saw if you no-clipped out of reality, fell through the floor of the real world into the space behind it. That image was posted to 4chan in 2019. What happened next is one of the more remarkable pieces of collaborative internet mythology produced in the social media era. The community that formed around the concept proceeded to construct, entirely collaboratively and with no central authority, a fictional universe of interconnected levels that exist behind reality, each with their own rules, their own entities, their own survival requirements, and their own aesthetic logic. The Backrooms now has thousands of defined levels, each described in wiki entries that maintain a consistent tone, dry, bureaucratic, survivalist, and each building on the established internal logic of the world. The entities that inhabit different levels are named, categorized, and have developed enough canonical behavior that different contributors writing about them maintain consistency. The rabbit hole is entering the wiki and reading descriptions of levels. Level 0, the yellow office space of the original image. Level 1, a vast concrete warehouse with forklifts and shipping infrastructure. Level, which functions differently depending on what you believe about it, and hundreds of others ranging from mundane to explicitly cosmological. The writing quality varies, but the best entries are genuinely unsettling in a way that horror fiction produced more conventionally rarely achieves, because the collaborative construction and the sustained commitment to internal consistency give the world a weight that individual invention doesn't have. Kane Pixels, a filmmaker, produced a short film adaptation in 2022 that became one of the most watched pieces of horror short film in YouTube history. The Backrooms had gone from an image caption to a multimedia franchise in 3 years. Story 20, the world of competitive eating alone in the dark. Mukbang as a cultural phenomenon. Mukbang, the Korean portmanteau of eating and broadcast, is a streaming and video format in which a host eats a large quantity of food, typically while talking to the camera or to a live chat, and the audience watches. The format originated in South Korea around 2010, where it attracted audiences who found the combination of eating sounds, the host's presence, and the social simulation of eating with someone satisfying to watch while eating alone. It has since globalized and diversified into a genre with enough internal variation to have subgenres. The rabbit hole is the psychological research that the mukbang phenomenon has generated. The format explicitly targets loneliness and social eating as the product it delivers. The audience is paying attention to not just what is eaten, but to the specific social comfort of eating in the presence of another person, even a mediated one. Research into mukbang viewership consistently finds that viewers often watch while eating their own meals, using the content to replicate the social dimension of shared eating that living alone or eating at an office desk removes. The ASMR dimension is a separate branch. Mukbang ASMR content focuses on the specific sounds of eating, crunching, chewing, the crinkle of packaging, the sound of liquid, which for viewers who experience autonomous sensory meridian response triggers a specific physical pleasure response. The intersection of mukbang content with ASMR has produced a subgenre that is almost entirely about the audio rather than the social simulation. The platform economics of mukbang are genuinely strange. Top mukbang creators on YouTube and South Korean platforms like askreddit TV earn significant income, primarily from audience gifts and advertising, for what is essentially a daily practice of eating in front of a camera. The content creation strategy involved: what to eat, what quantities, how to present the eating, how to maintain the social relationship with a live audience, is sufficiently studied within the creator community to have its own conventions and best practices. Story 21, the CP Foundation, a collaborative horror fiction wiki that has produced 6,000 entries and its own mythology. The CP Foundation is a collaborative fiction wiki that presents itself as a fictional government organization whose mandate is to secure, contain, and protect anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena that defy the laws of nature and that would be dangerous to the public if their existence were known. The wiki launched in 2008 and currently contains over 6,000 individual CP entries, each written in the bureaucratic style of a government classification document. Clinical, procedural, occasionally terrifying in the gap between the dry official language and the content it describes. The format is the entry point. Each CP entry describes an anomalous object or entity with its classification level, its containment procedures, and its description. The best entries are masterclasses in understated horror, SCP-173, a concrete humanoid that kills everyone within sight range when they blink and can only be contained by never letting it out of direct eye contact, told entirely through procedural language that describes how many people a containment team must include to ensure continuous eye contact, was the original entry that established the format and remains one of the most effective pieces of internet horror produced in the past 20 years. The rabbit hole is the depth and interconnection of the wiki. The entries cross-reference each other. The Foundation has internal factions with competing philosophies about how anomalies should be handled. And the most ambitious entries operate at cosmic scales, describing anomalies that affect the nature of reality, narrative, or causality itself. There are Tales section entries that tell stories set in the CP universe from the perspectives of individual researchers, anomalies, or the entities contained within them. The community that maintains it is large, active, and has specific quality control processes. New entries are submitted and voted on, with low-quality entries deleted and exceptionally popular entries gaining canonical status in the wiki's shared universe. Story 22: Train Hopping, a living subculture of people who travel America on freight trains without paying. Train hopping is the practice of boarding and riding freight trains without authorization. A practice that has existed as long as freight trains have, and that sustains a living subculture in the United States with its own vocabulary, its own networks, its own guides for which rail yards are accessible and which are heavily patrolled, and its own community of people for whom free freight travel is a primary means of long-distance movement. The rabbit hole is the skill and knowledge required to do it safely. The specific technique for boarding a moving freight train, which cars to target, how to approach, how fast the train should be moving, is something that experienced hoppers learn from each other or from written guides circulated within the community. The vocabulary includes specific terms for the types of cars that offer the most comfortable or accessible riding positions, and the specific network of freight routes means experienced hoppers know roughly where a given train is going and how long the journey takes. The danger is real and documented. People die every year from train hopping accidents, and the consequences of being caught range from a fine to federal trespass charges, depending on which railroad's property you're on and who catches you. The railroad police, the bulls in hopper vocabulary, actively patrol major yards, and the level of enforcement varies dramatically between rail companies and between regions. The community that sustains itself around train hopping is documented in several books and in the ongoing output of zines and websites produced by the hopper subculture. The most detailed accounts describe a lifestyle that intersects significantly with other off-grid American subcultures: hitchhiking, dumpster diving, squatting, and the various other practices that allow people to travel and survive at minimal cost while remaining invisible to systems that track movement through credit card transactions and identification requirements. Story 23: Competitive Birding, a worldwide pursuit whose top practitioners have seen more than half the species on Earth birding at the competitive level, is called listing, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Keeping a counted list of every bird species you have seen and verified, and trying to make that list as long as possible. The world list leaders, the birders who have seen the most species globally, have seen more than 8,000 of the roughly 10,000 bird species currently described by ornithologists. Reaching that level requires not just decades of dedicated birding, but international travel to every continent and most major island groups. Since bird species distributions ensure that seeing the most species requires going to the places where the most species are concentrated: the Amazon basin, the Himalayas, sub-Saharan Africa, the tropical Pacific. The rabbit hole is the specific culture of competitive listing. There are rules about what counts as a valid sighting, a bird seen, identified to species level, alive, in the wild, without instrumental assistance beyond binoculars. Heard but not seen birds count in some list categories and not others. Birds seen in captivity or escaped from captivity don't count. The American Birding Association maintains the official rules for competitive listing in North America, and the world listing community operates according to rules maintained by international birding organizations. Within the broader birding community, there is a specific subculture of twitchers, primarily a British usage, who travel on short notice to wherever a rare bird has been spotted in pursuit of adding a species to their national or regional list. A rare vagrant, a species that doesn't occur in a particular country, but that has been blown off course, will attract hundreds of twitchers to a specific location within hours of a confirmed sighting. And the network of alerts, WhatsApp groups, and Twitter accounts that disseminates rare bird sightings is its own sophisticated real-time information system. Story 24, the world of competitive jigsaw puzzle solving. Teams, tactics, and records that are broken in seconds. Wait, didn't we already cover jigsaw puzzles? The previous entry covered construction and collecting. This one is purely about competitive solving, which is its own world with enough distinct culture to earn separate treatment. The World Jigsaw Puzzle Federation runs the World Jigsaw Puzzle Championship, established in 2019 in Spain, which has attracted competitors from dozens of countries to assemble identical 500-piece puzzles in competition against other teams of 4. The championships are timed to the second. The record has been progressively reduced as teams develop more effective strategies, and the difference in completion time between the top teams is often measured in seconds, despite the total time being in the range of 10 to 15 minutes. The strategies that top teams use are genuinely systematic. Teams typically begin by dividing the puzzle spatially or by color gradient, with each member taking responsibility for a section, while a team coordinator builds the border and identifies where sections need to connect. Communication is constant and specific. Blue piece, convex on, right communicates in a language of shape and color that the team has developed as shorthand. The specific way pieces are sorted, the way the box is oriented, the sequence in which sections are assembled, all of it is planned and practiced. The international dimension of competitive puzzle solving has also revealed that different countries have developed genuinely different approaches to the same challenge. Speed differentials between national teams at the same skill level can reflect systematic differences in strategy that only become apparent in competition. And the exchange of techniques across national communities has produced progressive improvement in times that no single national community would have achieved alone. Individual competitive puzzle solving exists as a separate category, with solvers competing on different piece counts in different time frames. Story 25, the intentional community movement. People who build shared living experiments that most last less than 10 years. Intentional communities deliberately established living arrangements where people share resources, decision-making, and physical space with a group of people who have chosen to live together for ideological, practical, or spiritual reasons have existed throughout American history, from the Shaker communities of the 19th century to the commune movement of the 1960s and the eco-villages, co-housing developments, and income-sharing communities of the present. The Fellowship for Intentional Community maintains a directory of active intentional communities that currently lists several thousand worldwide. The rabbit hole is reading the histories. Most intentional communities fail, and the specific patterns of their failure are remarkably consistent across communities that appear to have nothing else in common. Ideological communities fail for the same reasons that secular communities fail. Spiritual communities fail the same way income-sharing communities fail. Rural eco-villages fail the way urban co-housing developments fail. The specific mechanisms, conflict over shared resources that the founding documents didn't anticipate, the entrance of new members who change the group's culture, the difficulty of making collective decisions under time pressure, the specific interpersonal dynamics that intensive shared living creates, repeat across completely different contexts. Twin Oaks in Virginia, one of the oldest continuously operating income-sharing communities in the United States, has been running since 1967 and has published extensive documentation of its governance structure, its crises, and how it has adapted over half a century. Reading that documentation is one of the more substantive rabbit holes available on the specific challenges of collective living, because the community has been honest about its failures in ways that most communities aren't. The broader rabbit hole extends into the sociological and anthropological literature on communes and intentional communities, which is substantial and takes the subject seriously as a laboratory for governance and collective action questions. Story 26: Cave diving, the most dangerous recreational activity in the world, with a community that knows it. Cave diving is exactly what it sounds like. Scuba diving in submerged cave systems, navigating flooded passages that may extend for kilometers beyond the open water entry point, in conditions where surfacing is impossible along the route and where a navigation error or equipment failure can be fatal before any rescue could reach you. It is the recreational activity with the highest fatality rate relative to participation, and the community that does it is not in denial about this. It is unusually clear-eyed about the risk, unusually rigorous about training, and unusually focused on the specific equipment and technique protocols that distinguish people who survive cave diving from people who don't. The rabbit hole is the training requirements. Entry-level cave diving certification requires completing several prerequisite certifications in open water technical diving, demonstrating specific equipment configuration skills, and completing a supervised cave course that covers the specific procedures for navigating flooded caves safely. The rule of thirds for gas management, continuous guideline use, the specific failure scenarios, silt out, light failure, team separation, and how to respond to each of them within a flooded cave passage. The caves themselves are the other dimension of the rabbit hole. The specific flooded cave systems that the cave diving community has explored and mapped represent some of the least understood geography on Earth. The Yucatan Peninsula's underwater cave systems, cenotes connecting to an enormous flooded network, are the largest known flooded cave system in the world and remain only partially explored. The specific discoveries that cave divers have made in these systems, entire ecosystems, fossil records, indigenous artifacts preserved by the water, have genuine scientific significance. The Tom Luang cave rescue in Thailand in 2018, where a junior football team was trapped deep in a flooded cave system, brought global attention to the specific capabilities that trained cave divers have and to the culture of the community. Story 27: Competitive debating, a global circuit where university students argue both sides of every issue by assignment. Competitive parliamentary debating is a global activity practiced at universities around the world in formats including British parliamentary, American parliamentary, and world schools, each with its own rules, but all sharing a central feature that most people find immediately strange. The side of the argument you defend is assigned to you by coin toss or draw, which means you may be required to argue positions you personally disagree with. And the evaluation of your performance has nothing to do with whether your position is actually correct. The rabbit hole is the specific skill set that competitive debate develops. Prepared debaters know not just their own position on contested topics, but the strongest version of every competing position, because their format requires them to be ready to argue any side of any assigned motion. This produces, at the top level of competitive debate, people who can construct the strongest possible argument for a position in 15 to 30 minutes of preparation time in a domain they may have no prior expertise in. The World Universities Debating Championship draws competitors from hundreds of universities worldwide and is contested in English, producing a specific international community of competitive debaters who have competed against each other across multiple continents and share a specific culture of argument, evidence, and rhetorical technique. The motions proposed at major tournaments are often genuinely difficult policy questions. The format requires debaters to engage with the actual substance of contested issues, and the quality of argument at top competitions is substantively higher than most political discourse on the same questions. The career trajectories of competitive debate alumni are skewed toward law, politics, journalism, and consulting in ways that suggest the specific skill set of structured argumentation under time pressure is transferable to contexts beyond the competition room. Story 28: The Voynich Manuscripts Community. Thousands of people who have spent years trying to read the same 240 pages the Voynich manuscript appears elsewhere in this collection as an ancient mystery. What deserves its own entry is the specific community of people, not professional academics, but engaged amateurs who have devoted significant portions of their lives to attempting to decode it, and the specific culture of this community, which is simultaneously collaborative and deeply fractious in ways that tell you something about what sustained engagement with an unsolvable problem does to people. The online communities dedicated to Voynich research include forums, mailing lists, and dedicated websites where researchers share observations, propose interpretations, and critique each other's theories. The tone is significantly more acrimonious than most academic communities, which researchers who have studied the sociology of Voynich research attribute to the specific nature of the problem. Because there's no way to definitively confirm or refute most proposed readings, the community cannot use the normal mechanisms of scientific consensus building to resolve disagreements, which means interpersonal credibility becomes a substitute for evidential resolution. The theories that circulate in the community are extraordinary in their variety. Herbal Pharmaceutical Manual in cipher, Alien Communication transcribed by a medieval scribe, Pharmaceutical Manual in an unknown language, Deliberately Constructed Hoax with no underlying meaning, Artistic Project in an invented language, Encoded Version of Latin or Arabic or Hebrew using a complex substitution system, and dozens of more specific proposals. Each periodically gets championed by someone who believes they've cracked it, generates community discussion, and is eventually undermined by specific textual features that the proposed reading can't account for. The community's relationship to the professional academic scholarship on the manuscript is complicated. Academics and amateurs occasionally produce genuinely complementary insights, but the specific social dynamics of the amateur community make it a challenging environment for collaborative progress. Story 29: The World of Competitive Miniature Painting. Tiny figures, extreme detail. In a global community of artists, miniature painting is the practice of painting small figurines, typically metal or plastic, ranging from about 25 mm to 54 mm in height, used in tabletop wargames and role-playing games, to a standard of detail that requires working at a scale where errors invisible to the naked eye become significant when examined under magnification. The competitive end of this hobby, where painters enter their work in competitions judged by panels of expert painters against the specific standards of miniature painting craft, is a small but globally distributed community with its own stars, its own conventions, and its own criteria for excellence that are significantly more demanding than the painting standard required to use miniatures in actual games. The entry point is the Games Workshop hobbyist ecosystem around Warhammer 40,000 and Age of Sigmar, which are the dominant tabletop miniature wargames in the English-speaking world, and whose miniature lines are the most common subject of hobbyist painting. But the competitive painting community ranges across the entire spectrum of miniature manufacturers and historical scales, with 1/35 scale military miniature painting being its own separate tradition with different aesthetic standards and different competition venues. The techniques developed within competitive miniature painting have real parallels to larger scale illustration and fine art. Non-metallic metal, in which reflective metal surfaces are painted using blended grays and whites rather than metallic paints. Object source lighting, in which the light sources in the scene around the miniature are painted consistently onto every surface of the figure. Smooth blending, in which transitions between colors are rendered with no visible brushstroke. All of these are techniques that require significant practice and that the miniature painting community has developed extensive instructional content around. The best competitive miniatures, when photographed macro, look like extremely detailed dioramas at full scale. Story 30: The geocaching community. 3 million hidden containers worldwide, maintained by volunteers. Geocaching is a worldwide outdoor treasure hunt using GPS coordinates, in which participants use the geocaching.com database to find the coordinates of hidden containers, ranging from large military ammunition boxes to containers the size of a fingernail. Locate them in the physical world. Sign the logbook inside and log the find online. There are currently more than 3 million active geocaches hidden in virtually every country on Earth, all of them placed and maintained by volunteers who are also participants in the activity. The rabbit hole opens when you understand the scale and variety. There are geocaches in Antarctica, on top of mountains, underwater, inside buildings, in urban environments disguised as rocks and bolts and drain covers and tree stumps, and in specific locations chosen because they offer views or access to places that most people pass without stopping. The people who hide geocaches spend significant thought on the puzzle or challenge dimension of the find. Some caches require solving a puzzle to obtain the final coordinates. Some require specific equipment to access. Some are hidden in physically challenging locations and on the reward of the place where the container is hidden. The specific culture of geocaching has its own vocabulary. Muggles are non-geocachers who might observe a finder and compromise a cache's location. FDF is a coveted status given to the first person to find a newly published cache. Trackable items are physical objects with registered tracking numbers that participants move from cache to cache and log, allowing their journey to be followed on a map. The app-based casual version of geocaching is what most participants experience. The deeper community is people who have found tens of thousands of caches, who travel specifically to find caches in new countries and regions, and who invest significant effort in hiding caches that offer genuinely rewarding experiences for the people who find them. Story 31: The world of competitive drone racing. FPV pilots who fly at 100 mph through obstacle courses they can't see. FPV drone racing, first-person view, is a sport in which pilots fly small, fast racing drones through obstacle courses wearing headsets that display the live video feed from a camera mounted on the drone, creating the sensation of flying from inside the aircraft. The drones reach speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The courses involve gates, turns, dives, and elevation changes that require precise control at speeds where reaction time matters, and the specific skill involved is different from any other form of pilot skill, because the pilot is navigating using a video feed that has a different field of view, depth cue, and orientation than physical presence in the aircraft would provide. The Drone Racing League was the first professional FPV racing league, operating custom-designed drones at indoor and outdoor courses and broadcasting on ESPN and Sky Sports. The league has attracted significant investment and produced a small number of professional pilots who earn income from competition prize money and sponsorships. But the amateur FPV community, which the professional league grew from, is considerably larger and more diverse than the organized competition circuit. The rabbit hole for most people begins with freestyle FPV, which is adjacent to, but distinct from racing. Freestyle pilots fly their drones through natural environments and around structures, performing acrobatic maneuvers and capturing footage that looks like nothing achievable by any other means. The specific physics of a small, agile, high-thrust drone allows flight paths that no fixed-wing aircraft or conventional multi-rotor drone can produce. And the footage shot from these aircraft, diving through gaps, pulling up from near ground level, threading between tree trunks, became a distinctive genre of drone video that spread through social media. The technical community around FPV drone construction is its own rabbit hole, Pilots typically build and tune their own aircraft, and the specific combination of components, frame, motors, electronic speed controllers, flight controller, camera, involves enough technical knowledge that getting started requires genuine learning investment. Story 32: The World of Historical Fencing. Researchers who reconstructed lost European sword fighting systems from medieval manuals. Historical European martial arts, HEMA, is the study and practice of historical fighting systems documented in European fighting manuals from the medieval and Renaissance periods, including the German tradition of Liechtenauer and his successors, the Italian tradition of Fiore de' Liberi and Filippo Vadi, the Spanish tradition of Destreza, and various other national schools documented in manuscripts ranging from the late 13th century to the early 18th. These fighting systems were developed for actual combat with actual weapons, longswords, daggers, palaxes, spears, wrestling, and were documented in treatises that were never intended as entertainment but as practical instruction. The rabbit hole begins with the manuscripts themselves, which are available digitally through organizations like the Liechtenauer, and which represent the primary source material for HEMA practice. Reading a 15th century German sword fighting manual, even in translation, is an immediately strange experience, because the combination of technical precision and the absolute matter-of-factness with which techniques designed to end people are described produces a specific reading experience that no fictional sword fighting manual replicates. The process of reconstructing the techniques from the manuscripts is what distinguishes HEMA from other martial arts. The practitioners are working from historical documentation rather than living transmission, which means interpretation is central to the practice. Two HEMA schools can interpret the same passage in the same manuscript and arrive at different physical techniques, and the specific debate about which interpretation is historically correct is the central, ongoing intellectual project of the community. The competitive dimension of HEMA uses protective equipment adapted from modern fencing and other combat sports, and the specific challenge of sparring with techniques designed for unarmored combat using blunt training weapons in a competitive context has produced genuine ongoing debate about how much the competitive context distorts the techniques away from their historical application. Story 33: The World of Competitive Knife Making. Bladesmiths who forge and finish knives for competition and commission knife making at the competitive level is a craft with organized competition, formal judging criteria, and a route to professional qualification through the American Bladesmith Society and Knife Makers Guild, whose standards are rigorous enough that journeyman and master smith ratings have genuine meaning within the community. The television show Forged in Fire, which has run on the History Channel since 2015, introduced a large audience to the world of competitive blacksmithing and knife making. But the show's format, 4 contestants competing to produce a functional knife in a few hours, doesn't fully represent the craft at its highest level. The rabbit hole is the metallurgical depth. Bladesmiths working at a high level understand the specific heat treatment requirements of different steel alloys, the carbon content and alloy composition that produce different performance characteristics in a blade, the specific techniques for forge welding pattern, welded steel, Damascus, in common usage, though not historical Damascus, that produce the characteristic visual patterns in the blade, the heat treatment of a finished blade, the specific temperature at which it is quenched, the medium used for quenching, the temperature to which it is tempered, affects hardness, flexibility, and edge retention in ways that are predictable given sufficient metallurgical knowledge. The American Bladesmith Society's journeyman test requires producing a blade that passes a series of performance tests, cutting rope a specific number of times cleanly, chopping through a 2x4 without damage, and flexing the blade to a 90-degree angle without breaking. These are tests of both craft skill and metallurgical knowledge, since a blade that fails any of them has a specific, diagnosable cause related to either fabrication or heat treatment. The collector dimension is its own rabbit hole. High-end custom knives by well-regarded makers sell for thousands to tens of thousands of dollars at auction, and the community of collectors who track makers, styles, and provenance is genuinely sophisticated. Story 34: The Lost Media Community. People who spend years tracking down TV episodes and films that were never preserved. The lost media community is focused on a specific and genuinely alarming fact about the history of recorded media. An enormous proportion of early television, early film, early radio recordings, and early video game content no longer exists in any recoverable form because the institutions that created it didn't preserve it, stored it on materials that degraded, taped over it to reuse expensive recording stock, or simply lost it through institutional carelessness that nobody at the time understood would matter. The BBC famously wiped or junked hundreds of episodes of its early television programming, including entire series of Doctor Who, before anyone understood that television archives would have historical value. Early American television was similarly treated. Shows broadcast live were sometimes recorded onto kinescope film, but many were not, and the recordings that were made were not systematically archived. The scale of what is genuinely gone, never to be recovered from any source, is significant, and the lost media community maintains the Lost Media Wiki as the primary catalog of known lost content and ongoing search efforts. The rabbit hole is the search process. Some lost content has been found in unexpected places, in the collections of private individuals who recorded off-air, in foreign country archives that preserved programs the producing countries didn't, in caches of material discovered in basements and storage units. The lost media community coordinates search efforts, collects information about who might have recordings, and celebrates finds with genuine excitement. Finding a surviving copy of a thought-lost episode of a 1960s television program is treated as a genuinely meaningful cultural recovery. The most popular ongoing searches, specific missing episodes of specific shows, specific lost films by known directors, specific early video game prototypes, are documented in enough detail that readers who've never heard of the specific program or game understand exactly what's missing and why it matters. Story 35: The World of Competitive Hot Dog Cart Operation. A subculture with its own regulations, roots, and street mythology. Street vending, the operation of food carts in public spaces, is subject to a regulatory environment that varies dramatically between cities and that is produced. In the cities where street vending is most established, a genuine subculture with its own economics, its own community, its own mythology, and its own knowledge base about which locations are productive, which regulatory approaches are effective, and which relationships with authorities and property owners are worth cultivating. The specific world of New York City's favorite hot dog cart vendors is the most extensively documented version of this subculture. The permits required to operate in the city are subject to a lottery system and legally transferable, which has created a secondary market where operating permits change hands for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars because demand dramatically exceeds supply. The specific dynamics: permit holders who license their permits to operators, operators who work specific locations that have established customer bases, the specific seasonal and event-driven patterns that make some locations productive at specific times, constitute a sophisticated informal economy. But the rabbit hole extends to the broader world of street vending across the United States. The tamale carts that operate by informal route networks in Los Angeles, the truck-based vendors who gather at specific locations on specific days, the competing regulatory frameworks that cities have adopted, ranging from effectively banning street vending to actively encouraging it as an economic development strategy. The ethnographic literature on street vending in American cities is substantial, and the communities it documents are genuinely complex. The international dimension opens the rabbit hole wider. Street food vending cultures in Southeast Asia, Mexico, and West Africa have been operating for generations within specific regulatory and social frameworks that produce their own community structures, their own knowledge networks, and their own mythology about the best locations. the most productive times, and the techniques that distinguish successful vendors from struggling ones.